Friday the 13th may be the biggest slasher franchise ever, with 12 films, multiple video game series, and countless comics and merchandise. When I did my original animation, The Evolution of Jason Voorhees, I had no idea it would ever get to 10 million views. In fact, after I first uploaded it, I was in a pretty dark place and wasn't sure what direction to take my channel, but after it took off and I had some requests come in, The Evolution of has become my bread and butter ever since. But I think most of the Friday films themselves are pretty mediocre. Starting out as a cheap ripoff of the Halloween series, it finds its footing a little later on, but there's something that makes these films infinitely rewatchable. It may be the simplicity or the little caveman inside of me that just loves watching people slash and dash. With that said, let's jump into the slasher franchise and rank them from worst to first. And there will be spoilers throughout, so you've been warned. Starting with the biggest stinker, at least according to me, you can have your own opinion and you put those down below if you want. And coming in at number 12 is the Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Released in 1989, long after the rose had fallen off of this franchise, Jason Takes Manhattan shows exactly what can go wrong when a series relies on doing the same thing over and over and over again. Even if they change the location, the uninventedness of this entry is easy to smell from a mile away. The movie seems to be edited rather sloppily, even by Friday standards, and spends most of his time wasting our time on a boat with uninspired kills before finally landing in Vancouver. New York, with air quotes, where he gets into a few shenanigans worth watching, I guess, like the boxing match. But for the most part, it doesn't quite live up to the premise of Jason Takes Manhattan, and is really more like Jason Briefly Visits Manhattan. On to number 11, and probably the weirdest entry in the franchise, Jason X. Now, it goes without saying, when a franchise takes its non-sci-fi related protagonist to space, it's most odds jumps the shark. Like, they've launched Leprechaun, James Bond, and Pinhead into space, and with this film, Jason Voorhees joins their ranks. And at this point in the series, Jason Voorhees' typical slasher fare was no longer playing at the box office, and they thought the only way to renew interest was by putting out either crossover films or weird sci-fi mashups, and this falls into the latter. The film wasn't a complete disaster because with the new location in space, we get some of the most interesting kills to date, and the new look that Jason upgrades to is actually pretty cool, Uber Jason, but like many flicks that tried to cross genres before, this one falls flat as both a sci-fi film and as a horror flick. And coming in line at number 10 is Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday. Released in 1993, and much like Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, it came out at a time when the slasher genre was at an all-time low both critically and financially. This is probably the first film since Part 2 that really tried to add anything new to the lore of Jason Voorhees, including his family element into this film, but with this added family tie comes a little too late in the franchise to really jive with the other films, and it feels like a bit of a weird stepchild. It also doesn't really help that Jason is hardly in this movie, at least in physical form, as he apparently has gained the ability in this film only to possess other people's bodies and continue his kill spree. The very ending fight when Jason comes back in full form is probably the most exciting part of the movie, but after nearly an hour and a half of family drama and people acting woodenly pretending to be our slasher hero, it isn't enough to save this film from falling a little flat. While I appreciate they tried to do something new, for the most part, it just kind of fails to bring anything of interest to the franchise. Alright, and coming in at number 9 is the Friday the 13th remake, which is really only a remake for the first 5 minutes and then becomes just like any other Jason sequel after that. Now, Jason in this film is absolutely brutal and ruthless, and he really looks like he could slice and dice you without much effort. This is the first film to have a person looking for a family member who was possibly killed by Jason, but where this film falls apart for myself is turning Jason into not just a mindless killer, but into this cunning psychopath who kidnaps some of his victims for months on end and digs out tunnels under Camp Crystal Lake to travel, which doesn't really quite work with my view of Jason as a killer who's just kind of senselessly killing for revenge. That makes sense, but to have him torturing someone for seemingly no reason just doesn't quite add up. But overall, this film does have some fun parts, so I'd say check out the remake. And coming in just under the remake at number 8 is actually going to be the original Friday the 13th from 1980. Now, I know a lot of people appreciate this film because it created the origins of Jason, but for the most part it's pretty boring and clinical. While on first view it's kind of fun trying to figure out who the killer is, on rewatch you really feel the slow pace. And what makes this film more interesting than the previous films on this list though is simply Betsy Palmer's performance as Pamela Voorhees, who is revealed to be the killer at the end of the third act, and because of this twist we have to assume that a near elderly lady has the strength to toss a full-grown body through windows, but putting that aside, her acting is second to none and makes this film definitely worth watching. And at number 7, just a little bit better than the first in my opinion, is Friday the 13th Part 2. Now Jason may not look how we know him, sporting a bag over his head and his hillbilly attire, but he's still the same killer that we would come to recognize in later films. Apparently seeking revenge for his mother's death now, Jason lets loose and starts to really give us the kills the franchise would become known for. While the MPAA would make some cuts, the film still manages to pack a brutal punch and adds more to the series while giving us our first non-dream sequence Jason. And yeah, the reason why he's alive is kept pretty vague. But if you don't think too much and just watch it for what it is, there's a lot of fun to be had with Part 2. And continuing on with the list and staying in order is Friday the 13th Part 3 3D, landing at number 6. This is the first film to give Jason his iconic hockey mask and his more hulking appearance. It was shot to cash in on the 3D craze that boomed in the 1980s, and there's a few shots that just don't really look quite right when watching on home video. But with that aside, it did open them up to having a few more inventive kills like the harpoon gun. That's one of my favorites. And while sure, the plot of the movie is much like the previous ones where Jason is just picking off more guests at Camp Crystal Lake, but I feel like it's more competently and tightly shot this time around. Also, fun fact, this was more or less just shot as the final film in the series, so if you just wanted to watch the first 3 for a good trilogy, you could do that and you have a pretty good time with it, I think. And at number 5 on my list is the crossover flick Freddy vs. Jason. While I consider this to be more of a Freddy film than a Friday film, the movie does manage to give Jason a larger body count. It weaves together the two killers without too much disbelief as Freddy wakes up Jason in hell to do his bidding. As expected, Jason has a ball of a time, but this time killing outside of Camp Crystal Lake, Jason is able to let loose on whichever teenager he sees fit, but when he starts having too much fun, Freddy steps in to take down the hockey masked mute. So this movie sounds pretty dumb, but it's pretty well put together. It has some questionable music choices, I think, especially considering that it came out in the early 2000s, but I tend to forgive some of the weaker elements like the acting and the lack of Freddy kills because I just have so much fun with this film. Okay, so now picking up at number 4 is Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter. This may be the most complete feeling Friday film. Even though Jason was supposedly dead at the end of Chapter 3, he's easily brought back and now slashing a new batch of teenagers. What makes this one different than the last few films is the teenagers are written stronger, and we get a more interesting protagonist in Tommy Jarvis, whose story would continue in the next 2 films. And while Jason is more monster-like in appearance thanks to Tom Savini, who had done makeup on the first film, and he was coming back just to close off Jason's story because they filmed this really knowing this is definitely the last one, guys. So that's why they call it the Friday the 13th, the final chapter. But of course, it didn't end up being that way. But still, this film does have a really finite ending to Jason's story. Is it a finite ending to Tommy's story? Maybe not. Maybe that's what they were hoping on picking up on afterwards. And maybe the next entry on my list will explain more about that. So, moving on. Okay, so now these next 3 films on my list may not be better than Part 4, but I personally just enjoy watching them more. So at number 3 on the list is the 5th entry in the series, Friday the 13th, A New Beginning. I think a lot of the hate this film gets is truly misplaced. Now, Jason was officially on record killed at the end of Part 4, so the killer in this film remains a mystery. Is it Tommy Jarvis? Is it someone else? You don't really know, but eventually it gets revealed to be an angry ambulance driver seeking revenge for his portly son's death. While the premise is a little weak, this film probably packs some of the most brutal and interesting kills of the franchise. And with one of the highest kill counts in the series, the pace moves along pretty quick while keeping the viewers guessing who the killer is. The first film since the original Friday to achieve this. Now, I know since Jason doesn't officially appear, a lot of people get mad at this entry, but viewed on its own, I think this is a film that has a lot to offer. So I'm probably going to make even more heads roll with my next entry at number 2 on my list, but I'm going to have to go with Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood. While it's probably one of the weirdest ideas in the series, pitting Jason against a psychokinetic young girl, but she makes a pretty formidable foe, giving Jason his toughest match at this point in the series and probably the toughest match until Friday vs. Jason, 20 years later. While I know this film isn't perfect, it sometimes comes across as a little slapped together, especially the ending where the girl summons her dead, but not rotted for some reason father to drag Jason back to the bottom of the lake. And I still get a lot of enjoyment out of it, and it's just a fun movie, so if you guys have ignored this movie in the series, go check it out. I like it. And coming in at number 1 in my rankings is the 6th entry of the Friday films, Friday the 13th Part 6 Jason Lives, not taking itself too seriously while still crafting a competent film. This manages to bring back Jason Voorhees from the dead in kind of like a throwback to like Frankenstein from the 1930s, and then it immediately cuts to a parody of James Bond style opening, which should basically be everything you need to know to understand this film in the franchise. Upon release, the movie was met with negative reactions from critics and pretty mixed reactions from fans of the franchise, but looking at it as a send-up of the tropes from earlier entries in this franchise, the film has much to offer. From the cheesy 80s songs to the tongue-in-cheek referential dialogue, this film comes across more as a precursor to the now overdone self-referential horror films that boomed after the original Scream. This is the first film in the series that I go to when I'm ready to rewatch, and it's mainly because of how much fun I have watching it. And if you're looking for a perfect Friday film to watch with a group of friends, look no further than Part 6. Okay, well that's my ranking for the Friday films. What do you think of my order? Good, bad, ugly? Let me know your rankings down below, and before I sign off, I'll thank my patrons for supporting my animation channel, and in turn this channel as well. I'm just gonna thank a few at a time for each video as to not make these endings too long. So thank you to Minkus Baby, Ethan Roshcam, and Marie Suri, as they were the first 3 people to pledge to the Patreon. So check out the Patreon to support the animations, and until next time, keep on keeping on. I gotta work on a better ending, guys. I'm sorry. Beep beep boop boop bop beep boop.